Hello, my name is Dan Pecci. I'm a conference organizer this year, and I also am a senior at Tufts. So the talk that is at this time is AI and children that covers the sort of intersection of where artificial intelligence is going and children's rights. And we have Olivia Koshy from UC Berkeley. She is involved with the head of machine learning at Berkeley, which is an extracurricular organization at Berkeley, very similar to Machine Intelligence Community, and we're excited to have her here and tell us more about AI and children. So.
Awesome. Hello. So, if I stand here, can you guys hear me okay? Cool. So I think the first question I usually get pretty often is how does AI and children's rights really affect each other? What are we really talking about here? And so I just want to give you a quick little example to get you guys in the mindset and thinking about the problems I've been thinking about. So let's meet Max. Max is a completely fictional character I've made up for the purposes of this presentation. But he's a really small child that is maybe living in 2025, and kind of like any normal kid, plays with toys. And in 2025, there's a toy that he has. It kind of might look like a bear or a robot kind of ish thing. But this is a special toy. It's a toy that uses AI to, converse with him, right? So you might use NLP to try and understand what he's talking to you, and try and give responses back, as well as it might use computer vision to try and understand, what kind of facial emotions the child is expressing in order to help comfort the child, right? And this sounds pretty cool, right? As a parent, I would love to have, a toy that could, keep my child occupied and happy, and that sounds pretty great. And so it sounds like something that actually could do well in a market. But what happens if this child, for example, releases information in confidence as its doll or toy or friend, that this child's actually being abused? That's a really scary question then, right? So for the company who is actually producing this toy, first off, is there privacy issues where these companies are able to hold on to this very sensitive and personal information, as well as beyond that, do they hold legal responsibility to report this to law enforcement, right? And who's actually regulating that and making sure that these companies do so, if that is something they should be doing, right? And so I bring up this example just to kind of give you a sense of what the things I've been thinking about and what the work around this project kind of thinks about. And so this is actually a project that is led by the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, the law school, and was proposed by UNICEF, as well as the World Economic Forum. And this is a project that is basically trying to look at how children's rights is going to be affected by AI technology in the next however many years. And so I think the natural question is, where do I fit in? Where do I come from? So I actually am currently a senior at UC Berkeley. I study computer science, and I actually don't come from a law background at all. I have not taken a single poli-sci class or history class actually at Berkeley. And I come from a very technical background. So like Dan mentioned, I lead machine learning at Berkeley. And the reason why I got kind of really interested in this project is because I come from such a technical background, and I run an org there, and we do a lot of very technical projects, as well as I've worked on the Facebook computer vision team, the probabilistic programming team, as well as on an autonomous drone startup. And these are the kind of questions that I don't see a lot of people asking, and I think it's really easy for us to kind of stay in our technical siloed and not actually look into these kind of issues and problems that are arising as an implication of our work. And so that's kind of where my interests come from in this sector. And it's really awesome because I get to work with people from the Human Rights Center. These are lawyers who've been doing work in law for however many years and are very specialized in areas I'm not specialized in at all, and kind of talk to them and explain to them how AI works, how machine learning works, what a neural network is, questions that they have a ton of questions and they have no ability to answer. So it's a pretty cool collaboration. So I want to give a quick background and a briefing on kind of a little bit on what children's rights look like. And so the big main point where you kind of can look at children's rights is the Convention of Children's Rights that took place. And kind of there's these 4 Ps that I'd like to kind of acknowledge here: the prevention of harm, the participation in decisions affecting them, protection against discrimination, all forms of neglect and exploitation, and the provisions of assistance to children for basic needs. And so if you look at these, you can see that they're very general. And a lot of the documentation and legality around children's rights is actually not really super defined or even kind of up to speed with a lot of technology that's happening today. And these are very, very broad generalizations of kind of like, what can actually become a children's rights, or like what's actually a right violation. And so that's kind of what the project really aims to do, is kind of, help look at, what like wording do we need to change, and like what do countries and companies need to be like focusing on to ensure they're actually not violating human rights issues. So I just want to kind of give a quick background on that. So where does this all manifest from? And so I think one thing today I will touch on that a lot of the things that I'm talking about today aren't inherent to machine learning and AI, but what they're inherent to is data. And with the rise of like the data revolution, we still have to be thinking about all the data collection and all the things that are happening with this data, because when you have this amount of data, the obvious solution is to go and use machine learning to learn something from it. And so even though a lot of this technology that I'm going to talk about today, isn't inherent to machine learning necessarily, I think it's really important as people who are interested in this space to be very aware, of the issues that arise when we have this massive amount of data. And so these are kind of three areas I want to touch on today: privacy, bias, and transparency. I also want to just say right now, I kind of want this more to be a discussion. So at any point during, like my presentation, I'd love if you just like want to ask a question or have a thought, just raise your hand. This presentation isn't supposed to be a talk of me telling you what we should do. It's more of something that I think we should all try and engage in, right? As people who are in this field, it's really important for us to have these kinds of conversations. And it's a conversation you don't normally get to have. So I'd love at any point if you guys have thoughts or questions, just raise your hand and ask them. Cool. So privacy. This is kind of the first area I want to focus on. And it's a really interesting point because with the rise of technology, there's very little privacy in the day-to-day lives of a child. If you think back to your childhood, you didn't have social media, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have these toys that were recording you, right? And it doesn't have to be as obvious as like them logging onto a Facebook account. It can be as things that are just in their home that they have no control over, such as an Amazon Alexa, right? Those machines in our home today are recording things, and they are, using that data in different sorts of ways. And what that does is it, kind of like sets children up not to necessarily have the same kind of privacy a lot of us had when we were children. So this is child's protections against unlawful interference with his or her privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and to unlawful attacks on his or her honor or reputation. And so I think one of the actually most interesting things about children's rights in regards to privacy is that a lot of these issues are things that children don't have the ability to say no against, right? A lot of these decisions are actually made by parents, and a lot of times these decisions are made with a lot of ignorance, not understanding how this data can actually be used. And so as we kind of move into this age where children are interfacing with different technology all the time, it's actually really important for us to be aware of, how are these technologies being consumed, as well as how can we better regulate them. And so what some of you might be familiar with is something called Copa, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And this is the regulation that's supposed to help us prevent children's data from being used and sold. And so this basically says if you're under the age of 13, your information is not allowed to be used unless with parental consent. And so this is why, if you have a Facebook account, you might notice that they don't actually have, you're not like technically allowed to have an account if you're under 13. But as many of you know, most people will just click, I am any age above 13, and you can make an account, right? And it's actually pretty easy to, be on these online platforms or to be using any of these kind of websites that use your data without actually being over the age of 13. And this is actually really harmful because most, children at this age don't understand what they're actually signing up for, right? They don't actually understand, what they're posting or, how it's being used. And it's really important for us to kind of think about, are we doing enough to actually ensure that children's rights are being protected in these cases, right? If a child is 8 years old but they sign up for, some kind of account, is it really on the child for them to know what they were signing up for? Is it really their responsibility, or is it our responsibility as the people providing these services to have higher standards for what we do to ensure that these young children don't have access to these kind of tools that could be harmful? And so, like I said, this isn't just online social accounts. This is things like Amazon Alexas, that are in our home today. So that was something I think that's super interesting to touch on. and it's not something that the children are signing up for. And I like to focus on this isn't just, social media accounts, or this isn't just like Amazon Alexas, but these are also toys now that are actually being created for the specific purpose, right? So there are a bunch of toys now that are actually just like, marketed for child friendly. So there's a kind of like an iPad version for like kids, right? And in that, there are, like you get data about the parents, you get email addresses, you get a lot of sensitive information, and there's not a lot of regulation around these, and there's not a lot of high standards for security. And so it's really important that we're, taking seriously the concerns of privacy for these children, because, once this kind of information leaks at such a young age, this is going to change their life pretty much forever. So next area I want to focus on is bias, because this is actually a really inherent problem to machine learning. And when you have a lot of data, what machine learning algorithms do really well is learn those patterns, right? And if you have bias inherently in your data, you're going to have issues. And so I think a really interesting example to look at is how is machine learning used today to actually create opportunity in the world, right? And so this is actually taken, this image here, using machine learning to determine a data-driven understanding of what's important to you, showing only candidates that fit that specification. And this is actually taken from a real website of a real product that's being used right now, and it's a startup where they're using machine learning to help companies recruit better, right? And this is a really great thing in a lot of ways, because a lot of companies struggle with recruiting, right? It's a very hard problem to solve. But on the flip side, if how we're training our models doesn't represent fairly what we really want to look for, it's very easy for us to run into bias issues today. And so one thing that is actually something that we should start thinking about is when we're using this AI technology to help us make these kind of really big decisions, whether it's around education, or like whether it's around like recruiting and getting jobs, or education and getting students accepted into colleges, what kind of technology is being deployed to help us make those decisions, and is the decision-making process for these models actually fair and ethical and non-biased, right? And so this is actually something that's like I think about a lot, and it's really kind of scary in that sense, is if we don't have good ways to train these models, like should it even be okay for us to use this technology? And I think one thing that happens a lot of times is you don't have this necessarily really good understanding of where these decision-making patterns are coming from, right? And so I guess to bring this back more to like children, right? It's really easy to see as like for future children how this might be a problem, but for kids today, what kind of things are we doing that's going to stream into like their future life? And a lot of service providers now are offering these like kind of kid-friendly versions of their product, right? You have YouTube Kids, you have Netflix Kids, you have Messenger Kids, and can insert any other product there. And by no means am I saying these are bad products. I think it's an amazing tool as a child to have access to YouTube, right? There's so much incredible educational content on all of these sites, right? But at the same time, I'm unsure if we have high enough standards for these companies, right? And so one thing that's really interesting, so for example in YouTube Kids, is that it's a completely machine learning algorithm that kind of flags videos as kid-friendly and appropriate. And these machine learning algorithms have recommendation systems for children to maximize the time they're on YouTube Kids, right? And that's actually something that's really scary, right? Because we're basically feeding our children content, right? And if you give a child an iPad, they could probably sit there and watch videos for hours and hours on end. And what are our recommendation systems actually teaching these children, right? And so going back to the bias aspect of this, if we're training on what your child has watched previously, and your child might be, a young girl, you might kind of start in the future biasing recommendation systems towards things that young girls like to watch, right? And I think this kind of goes back to a question that was held earlier during the Women in ML panels, where does these divergence in men and women occur? And it honestly occurs at this really young age, especially when you're using previous data to kind of encourage students what they should be watching, right? And so, in YouTube Kids, it's very easy for these algorithms to unknowingly bias, very young girls and boys to certain areas to be interested in, right? That could pretty much set them up later on for, what they end up pursuing in their life. And that's, I think, something that's like kind of a little bit scary, and something we should really think about is these recommendation systems, are they actually trained in a way that we are actually supporting students, like children, learning and getting access to really fun educational content, or are we siloing them into what we believe they should like and learn? And it's something that, I think is really interesting, and just a really specific way where bias can actually really creep in, and it's a way you don't really think about, right? Like YouTube consumption. Like I'm sure all of you watch YouTube all the time, and I'd be curious for you guys, how often do you get something in your recommendation for YouTube feed that doesn't you know, totally like come from like your previous watching or something that very much fits yourself, right? How often do you get pushed outside of your, bounds of interest, right? And they do that for a reason. And I think that's one thing that is really scary as a child is you are very susceptible to a lot of these, you're very susceptible to this kind of media. And so the last kind of point I want to touch on that I think is really interesting, and that I'd love afterwards, especially if we could talk about a little bit more, is transparency. And so the biggest issue for a lot of these areas is that there's very little transparency to hold anyone accountable, right? So think about any of these, pretty much, if you are an outsider to ML, the way you look at ML is it's like you put something in, it's some voodoo magic, and you get it out, right? And that's AI, that's ML. And I can tell you for a fact, I know that's how people think about it because I'm working with 7 lawyers right now, and none of them knew how AI or ML worked, right? And so we actually sat there and whiteboarded and showed them what a neural network was and all this stuff, right? But the kind of scary thing is even us today, people who are doing research in ML, a lot of times, and studying ML, studying computer science, a lot of us today, it's kind of the same thing, right? We refer to it as a black box all the time. Sure, we understand there's matrix multiplications, there's activation functions, we kind of understand the architecture of these neural networks, but then at the end of the day, if I ask you, how did your model make a decision, a lot of times you couldn't really tell me, right? You couldn't actually point, oh, we made a decision here and that's why the network produced the results it did. And so this kind of brings out a bigger issue of, like I said, transparency and accountability. A lot of these models today, there is no transparency, and when you're optimizing for a loss function, you actually don't understand what else the model is learning, right? And so this is actually really important when you're thinking about different scenarios. For example, going back to those recommendation systems, right? What kind of things are these models picking up on that we could change, right? And let's say we want to alter it so our model did necessarily optimize for the max amount of time a child would spend, but also maximize for the amount of material that they'd see. For example, you want them to look at science and math and history and poli-sci. Is that something we can really encode into our model? Are those decisions we can try and figure out a way to introduce? And so I think that's the biggest thing is how can we make models that are more transparent so we can hold people accountable and hold the decisions we're making accountable? And so I guess I'd like to end that with, I think it's really easy as a researcher or as a student, as someone in industry, to kind of look away and say, I'm not in charge of regulation, I'm not in charge of, a country, I don't have any power, right? And to say that, I can't do anything about this problem. But the fact is that this community is actually incredibly small, and the number of people who are able to talk on a topic like this is actually a very, very tiny percentage of people, right? And as someone who is a part of this community, I really challenge all of you to, take that and remember that, and whatever work you're doing, whether it's research or you're working in industry or even you're just a student learning, to ask these hard questions and have these kind of conversations, because we're not going to change this from bottom down, right? I don't think our government overnight is suddenly going to start realizing this is a problem and kind of implement it. Where I see this, going is people in the community realize this is a problem and kind of as a grassroots effort, kind of make this something that we think of as a priority in the future. So with that, I hope you guys all kind of think about the work you're doing a little differently. And not to say that it's not incredible and important and it's going to make great strides in humanity, but there are consequences to the work that we're doing too. If you have any questions, feel free to come talk to me after.
Yeah, there's 5 minutes right now. Oh. So if anyone's interested, feel free to come up with the microphone. Hello.
Hi, so I'm David. Nice to meet you.
Hey.
So I was wondering if there's anything that I could do right now, is there any change that I could do right now in order to be more responsible for the outcomes of the models that I'm training for, be it work or research or whatever?
So like I said, I think the first biggest thing is to engage in conversations about this, right? And so if you're doing research work in general, one of the biggest issues, like our data sets are not representative of like the population as a whole. And a lot of times you're optimizing for publishing a paper rather than actually getting the most equitable results that are true, that hold on all accounts and are robust. And so making sure you have those conversations either with yourself, your peers, your manager, whoever it is, to ensure that's something that you're also thinking about and focusing on. And you know, sometimes that means taking extra time and trying and finding a different data source that's more representative of like a bigger sample of people, or you know, what else it is, and actually taking the time to look into that. I'd say is like the biggest thing you can do, because having those conversations then will trickle around to other people having those conversations.
Sure. All right, thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it was awesome talking to you guys. Feel free to come find me if you have any more questions.